Welcome to Performance Science, a podcast exploring the science of performing and the role of performance in society. I am Professor Aaron Williamon, head of the Centre for Performance Science, a partnership of the Royal College of Music and Imperial College London. Here in the Centre for Performance Science, our research examines and reflects on what performing can tell us about how people interact, develop, work, learn, and play. The podcast encourages us to think differently about the ways in which performing is part of our lives. And in this series, I'm interested in exploring how performers support their own well-being, as well as how they meet the distinctive and sometimes intense challenges of their work. In this second episode, we delve into the topic of safeguarding performers' mental and physical health. As we touched on in episode 1, performers can encounter many challenges to their well-being. Some of these challenges may be specific to the particular area of work. Think of different physical demands that a circus artist or a pianist can face. But there are others that span multiple areas of performance. From research in the Centre for Performance Science, we have been able to trace how different groups of professionals experience different challenges to their well-being, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic and the following years of recovery. We saw that, in general, high levels of anxiety and depression were reported among creative workers. We also saw that younger artists, as well as those who were more isolated, did less physical activity, and were already in poor health, were more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression. Many of the protective factors around healthy living were the same as those for the wider population, including exercising and high levels of physical activity, whether there was a stable source of income, and whether people could rely on good support networks. However, for many creative professionals, developing and accessing some of these protective factors can be tricky. Performance, by its very nature, can be intensely physical. Stable income, as we will see in future episodes, is hard to come by, and support communities in the creative industries can look very different to those in wider society. Artists often work antisocial hours, and so friends tend to move in the same circles. While this can be good in terms of meeting like-minded people, there's a delicate balance to strike in matching up professional and private life. My guests today are Claire Cordeaux from BAPAM, the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine, and Erin Sanchez from One Dance UK. Erin, can I start with you? Can you describe what One Dance UK is, what it does, and where do you fit into that picture?
Absolutely. One Dance UK is an organization that supports the dance ecology, and our work is around trying to ensure that dance ecology has everything that it needs to be able to work and be at their best. My role within that is around physical and mental health, so I look after the health, well-being, and physical and mental aspects of performance development.
And what inspired you to work in this field?
Oh, what a great question. As a performer myself, one of the things that I was deeply aware of from the beginning of my training was how important the physiological underpinnings of, as a dancer, of the performance were. So when my ballet teacher was teaching us ballet, we were also learning anatomy and physiology. That was a part of my training, and I was so lucky. Also, as a part of my training, I learned about somatic practices and how I can be aware of my introspective skills. And those two things together really launched me on a really positive training journey. And as I developed that training journey, I learned more about those different aspects. And thankfully, through my studies with Trinity Laban in the dance science degree, I learned even more. So I've always felt like that's been a vital underpinning. And the more people I met as I worked and trained and developed my career, I realized that wasn't there for them. That wasn't always a part of their training or a part of their experiences in their careers. And so I think I'm just fundamentally really deeply passionate about ensuring that everybody's got those competencies in their tool belt.
Thank you. Claire, could you tell us more about the role and mission of BAPAM and what you do there?
Yes, so yes, the Performing Arts Medicine, British Association is what it stands for. And we were set up by a group of doctors about 40 years ago who were passionate about musicians and understood the sort of health issues that musicians had and wanted to support them, and very often were themselves performers. And it's really developed from that. And so our role really is to provide free clinical assessments for any performer, and we've expanded to all performers now, and indeed some performance professionals, so people who might be backstage as well, to look at the sorts of issues that they are suffering from in terms of their health, which is stopping them from performing, or health issues that are impacting on their performance and their work in performing arts. So we offer the free clinical assessment. In the last few years, we've also been offering free therapy thanks to a number of different schemes that funders have supported. And we also do a lot of prevention work in terms of psychoeducation and other preventative health education to try and stop people from getting sick.
And can I ask as well, what drew you to BAPAM?
Well, I've always worked in health and social care as a manager and overseeing workforce development and various different roles. But alongside that, I've always been a musician. So when I saw the role advertised, it just seemed like a fantastic combination. And I suppose I'm old enough in my career that actually I've been able to look at how systems work, how health systems work, or how they don't work, and how to plan a systematic service across a country, which is really what we need to be able to do at BAPAM. And I think I've probably drawn on all of those skills, hopefully with the understanding of what it's like to be a performer informing that.
So with the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine, clearly you've got a very wide portfolio of support that you offer to performing artists. Could you speak first, and then I'll come to you, Erin, as well after that, to say how performing artists come to use your services, whether there's a drive to have support in the physical health realm primarily, or the mental health realm, or even where these two overlap. So what are the patterns of usage that you see within BAPAM?
So we track everybody who comes in, and when they register with us, when they give us a call or email us, we register them as a patient, and we always note the issue that they've come up with, and we define it as either musculoskeletal or psychosocial or hearing or voice or other if it doesn't fit into those categories, which is very helpful, not obviously just to make sure they see the right person, but also to for us to understand what the demand is at any point in time. And we've tracked that through systematically since 2019 using the system that we have. And you can see a real change over that period. So up until 2019, about 55 to 65% of people presenting, it was always with musculoskeletal issues. So pain, strain, that kind of thing. And mental health was about 15%. Mental health at COVID has just gone through the roof. And at one point, it was about 40% of what we do. Musculoskeletal issues dropped to about 30% of what we do. I think anybody wouldn't be surprised by that, really, because it was such a traumatic time. And where we are now is that musculoskeletal and mental health are about tracking each other. Probably mental health has dropped a little bit, which is encouraging. But if people are going back to work, then that's perhaps more understandable. Vocal health tends to be 15 to 20% of what we do. And again, that's grown since COVID. And I think if you consider that we've all had a respiratory disease probably several times, then it's not surprising that that's going to impact professional voice users. So yeah, that's the sort of makeup. But I suppose the other thing I'd raise around that is the sort of mind-body issue. So if you have a vocal health issue as a professional voice user, then very often psychological support is part of the rehabilitation. The same thing if you have musicians' vocal dystonia, then some form of psychotherapy might also be part of what happens if you're living with a long-term condition. If you've got tinnitus, there's very specific CBT that might be parts of that support. So I think, whilst we track those things, I wouldn't want to ignore the fact that actually a number of these issues all come together and they impact each other.
Mm. Yes, and with dancers, Erin, do you, in terms of the way that One Dance UK engages with support for both physical and mental health, has that picture changed at all for you since the course of the pandemic and from before till now?
Yeah, I think that I was reflecting on what you were saying there about physical and psychological issues and also social issues. And I think with regard to the pandemic, one of the things that we saw across the dance ecology, so not just necessarily with physical performers who would describe themselves as dancers, but also with choreographers and producers and managers and dance teachers, that there is a sense of intrinsic identity that is within the form of dance and doing that thing. And obviously during the pandemic, dancers were really limited in the way that they could do that. The dance ecology as a whole was very limited in whether they could meet in spaces and rehearse or perform or educate. And I think what we've seen definitely in terms of the impact of that is that there are physical issues around that. Many, many active performers during the pandemic were in touch with us to say, I've been holding on to an injury for 4 years. 8 years, 12 years. And since we're not performing right now, I thought I might get it sorted. So we saw an uptick of that. But additionally, we also saw issues that arose around mental health. So when people were forced to take a break from what are sometimes very demanding, unrelenting, they've been called in research, schedules, they suddenly found themselves with this moment to reflect and go, is this what I want to be doing with my life? Or where's the meaning and passion and purpose that I used to have? And that triggered some people within the dance ecology to retrain, to develop other skills, to potentially leave the profession for many reasons, which I'm sure we'll discuss in a moment. But I think one of the other things that we definitely saw was this kind of pause moment, this questioning to go, what are we doing here? And then finally, from a mental health perspective, that lack of connection with others. Dance is obviously a physically connected form. We touch each other when we dance, and dancers are very physically embodied when they're working and training. And the thing that we saw for sure was that from a mental health perspective, that lack of connection was really challenging for people. That loneliness factor, what we would call loneliness in the general population, haptic stimulation, wasn't there. And that negatively impacted people's mental health.
I want to get into the landscape moving forward in terms of how we see health and well-being being supported at the moment and how we can do that better moving forward. But what's clear to me is that both of your organizations have long and distinguished histories of helping and supporting performers. So there were clearly needs well before the shock of, say, the pandemic for organizations like BAPAM and One Dance UK to be on the scene. And can you say a little bit about what the sources of that need actually was? So why should performing artists be working under such conditions? And why should we have an organization that is particularly setting out to support performing artists above and beyond the support that you might find in society generally through the National Health Service and so on?
I think there are a number of things to pick up within that. One is that the sector is mainly freelance, and that's true of other sectors as well, but actually in some other sectors, then some of the larger companies get together to provide some sort of safety net for the workforce because people are moving between different employers, different contracts, and are quite heavily regulated. So if you look at construction, for example, you'd be wearing your hard hat and have your the scaffolding at height. And also there might be some sort of support across some of the larger companies. Whereas in our sector, that's not the case. Most people are freelance, but actually there aren't large employers that can support. And so I think we end up picking up people who are moving through this. I really like the way you call it the ecology, the ecosystem of, a venue, a contract, a manager, all sorts of different spaces and places and people, none of whom take responsibility for that individual, although there are areas of responsibility that they could take. And so it does very much fall onto the individual to take care of themselves, but that's not altogether possible. So I think, especially if you're in a space that doesn't allow you, if you're supposed to be eating healthily and drinking, but there's no water on site and there's no fridge, what are you supposed to do? So I think that is a sort of contributing factor. But there are also some very specific issues which are linked to the work, which make people more at risk of certain problems. So I mentioned musicians' vocal dystonia. Yes, you get a similar kind of issue in other areas, but actually it's very, very specific. Performance anxiety is a very specific issue, and I'm sure you've got lots of examples from dance. So you don't really see those, and the NHS does provide some specialist service. So there are specialist clinics for professional voice users, which are very helpful if you know where to find them, and you can get a referral there. But in general, it's for a more generalist health. And so, for example, if you had a cancer which caused you to not be able to play your woodwind instrument, a cancer of the mouth, of the throat, the cancer services in the NHS would be looking at getting you to speak and to swallow again, to be able to eat, but they would not be able to take you up to that high level muscle control that would allow you to go back to performing. So I think, it's what we need and what we are trying to provide, I think, is that occupational health service, which in other sectors would be provided by the employers. But in our sector, there is no employer to do it.
Can I ask you both to reflect on who the people are that can help in this process? What are the organizations and the people? I'm particularly interested in terms of what people within educational contexts can do to provide the foundation for healthy, sustainable careers. It doesn't stop just there, though. I think researchers need to work harder to understand the situation better. I think policymakers need to be engaged also to understand the situation better and to be able to take action. So who are those key players that will help BAPAM and One Dance UK move forward to support performing artists' health better?
$1 million question. I would like to preface this by saying that I think for as much as the pandemic was absolutely devastating for our sector, it did raise awareness of health. It was a health issue. We all had to think about health. People who hadn't normally thought about health started to think about it. And now I think the narrative in the industry has changed so that we aren't so much saying health is an issue, we should do something about it. We're much more talking about how can we do something about it? What should we do about it? And I think that is a very helpful shift.
I do believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that, the health and the well-being of our performing artists is a key ingredient to the health and well-being of society more generally. We know that the arts bring a lot to the table when it comes to bringing people together, making them connected, fighting some of the bad things in life, like being lonely, being depressed and anxious. So we need to help to bridge that gap, I think, between thinking about the arts as a nice add-on to a central plank of how our society runs and functions. Maybe you could both say something about how we could better engage policymakers, or what should we expect among our educators, our conservatoires.
there is legislation around this. There's, you talk about the duty of care. There's a moral duty of care, but also there's duty of care that is in legislation, which I don't think we use very well in this industry. And I think it's quite right that we don't insist on very heavy-handed approaches to legislation in order to avoid injury. But actually, we seem to ignore it, and we don't challenge it very much. So yes, there are a few cases where people have challenged it, but they're few and far between, really. And when you think, I've mentioned musicians' vocal dystonia recently, that is a reportable disease under Riddle. I don't know how many people in education institutions understand that and understand their potential responsibilities and the risks that they might be running. So I do think, for as much as it's very nice for everybody to understand, and we need to put time in the curriculum, and we'll teach it, and we'll provide resources. That's a really important thing to do. But I think there's a sort of stick bit to this as well, which says, in fact, you need to do this as an organisation in the same way that you employ people and you're following employment legislation. You also need to follow health and safety legislation, health, safety and welfare guidance, in order to prevent people getting sick, because actually that's a risk for the organisation.
And I think the other thing that we haven't talked about, which I think we have to, is the fact that there is maybe an internal desire from the people who are in these environments, working or training, or being educators or employers, that there is a high standard, right? As an artist, you want to push boundaries. You want to be excellent. And of course there's competition. Of course there's that desire for everyone to be competing with one another to be able to do that. But how does that mindset then change the way that we respond to rules and regulations about health and welfare? Because if I know that performing well means I need to rehearse another 4 hours, but I'm really tired and I haven't had dinner and I probably should stop, and maybe my contract says that I'm only supposed to do 6 hours today, will I? And I think that push and pull between the individual's desire for achievement and the rules and regulations that surround them, I think we need to try and get those more in alignment to get people to comply once we've got the right lens.
On the one hand, there's a drive to be better and to do better in terms of an individual's own performance levels. I also think that there's a meaning that people get from doing it. There's a love for doing it. And that can also create a bit of friction between wanting to engage and taking great meaning and value out of doing it, but then pushing oneself to a physical limit that may pose risk, or even a psychological limit that may pose risk. A lot of the work that we're doing here in the Center for Performance Science is taking a positive look on trying to enhance performance skills, to optimize one's performance within the boundaries of where they want to go, rather than just saying, well, let's do research that helps you tackle these challenges or remove these obstacles, or my goodness, you're going to face so many problems moving into your career. We rather would like to support the development of those strong, excellent performers so that they can then shape their career in a direction that they see fit. Erin, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, given your background as a dancer, if you had a conversation with yourself a few years ago, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself?
I think that one of the things I'm really aware of now is the importance of being reflective and being self-compassionate. And there's wonderful research that looks at how our responses to ourselves and our own arising feelings of stress or frustration or mental health concern are really important to the outcomes that we have. And I think that if I had that conversation with myself, my conversation would really be about, how do you find a balance? That striving, that achievement is incredibly important to you for your note, meaning and purpose in terms of the work, but also to your outcomes as a performer. But also how are you as a human being, and how do you interweave that self-compassion with that need to be able to manage the challenges because they're there. And you said something about the desire to focus on the positive and that underlying motivation that people have to fulfill meaning and purpose. And I think that often gets forgotten when someone transitions from doing something because they love it, maybe as a child, to doing something as a career. And I think navigating that change in our motivations, it's a really challenging balance to sort of go, okay, well, I do this to get paid now, or do I do this for the critical acclaim that I get, or do I do this because, I'm better than everybody else? And trying to kind of self-reflect on that and be compassionate with oneself when one goes, I still love this art form, but I may not be the best at it, or I may not at this moment be able to do it because I'm injured.
Thank you for that. What a great response. Sorry to put you on the spot as well, but could you reflect on some of the strengths mentally that performers need in order to go out and to carve a career in today's performing arts sector?
Yeah, I'll jump right in there. So I think intrinsic motivation is fundamental. Why do you do something? Because of love, because of passion, because it serves something for you. Another one would be grit. So that combination of persistence and passion. How do I continue doing this? And I think, having that grit is incredibly important. I would also say that optimism is key, and an open approach. So that sort of positive, open approach to what may come along. And often creatives are, said to have this intrinsically, but maybe not. And I think that that's another really key aspect. And then I think just a realistic ability to evaluate your own performance, because I think there are so many external evaluations of your performance that you'll get. You need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and go, what is my performance right now? Where am I going? And that ability to set goals to be able to meet it. And then I think you just cannot forget engagement and ability to communicate. I think that in the performing arts, we often focus on the artist themselves, but they are an artist within an ecology of other people. It's not just the person who's on stage who makes the art. You have to be able to communicate your vision. You have to communicate what's good about what you're doing. You have to communicate when things are challenging. You have to make good relationships with the people that you're working with and training with. Being able to have social skills is so fundamental.
Your point about optimism reminds me that, typically the optimist is the one who invents the airplane, the pessimist invents the parachute. And sometimes we need both the airplane and the parachute in the performing arts.
And I wanted to say something about, you mentioned the importance of communication. And there's stuff in the work around performance anxiety, which addresses perfectionism, imposter syndrome, all of those sorts of things. And in fact, very often it's the getting to grips with the authenticity of your own performance and your engagement with the audience, which is the thing that people respond to, which might feel to you like not the perfect thing that you had in your mind. It might, that you're sort of struggling with as you wait for your performance, as you do your performance. And so I think that all comes within that communication and allowing yourself to be yourself with the skills and the creativity that you have actually is very often the thing that the audience will respond to. And I don't think as artists, we tell ourselves that enough. Because sometimes it's the wrong chord in pop music, for example. That is the thing that everyone goes, oh, that was fantastic, and nobody would know. And it was the unexpected thing that happened that makes that performance particularly special. And you really wish you'd been there that night. And we don't tell ourselves that. We sort of strive for that perfection which is then creates another stress for us to live with.
I think I'm right in saying that over the past few decades, we've seen a shift in the landscape in terms of how, not only how performing artists are supported, but the extent to which performing artists are able to talk about that support and to seek help openly. Can you comment on that?
I think there's a difference between types of performing artists and genre of performing artists as well. I would completely agree with you about that. But I think behaviours, healthy behaviours, support for health is greater in some areas than in others. So if people have gone through a more formal education process and health has been included in that curriculum, I'm not saying it's perfect. We know that people have injuries, but it's possibly better than, in some cases, than if you came through a more self-taught process. We did some analysis on the data that we have around musicians and compared the presentation of classical musicians versus other genres, and it was completely different. That peak of mental health presentation that happened around COVID and beyond does not appear with anything like the same severity for classical musicians. And why is that? Is that because they've come through a more, an institution that's provided an infrastructure that has allowed healthy practice at an earlier stage? Is it because contracts are better? You've got less uncertainty with your work. I mean, this is on a spectrum. It's all uncertain, but maybe there's less uncertainty. Certainly, classical musicians seem to be longer in their career. They present to us more when they're older. But I don't think that's because they get sicker than anybody else. I think that's because everyone else has dropped out. They're the only ones left standing. Whereas you see a very different, rock musicians come to us more in their 40s and 50s, and then it drops off. So I think there's very different ways when, times that you learn about how to keep healthy. And maybe if you have a health issue earlier in your career and you seek help for that, that causes you to change your behaviour later on. So I think it is quite a complex picture. I think in general, everyone's got greater awareness, and it's fantastic to see education institutions now including health routinely in what they do, which they didn't before. But I think also we have to think more broadly about where people are learning what they're learning and how they come to it through the different genres.
And I would say, has it changed? Absolutely. For all the reasons that you just said. Are we where we want to be? No. And I think that we never will be. And I think that bit is the really important bit to remember, is that, society has evolved and therefore our health behaviors have evolved, thank goodness. And we have seen an evolution as well in the performing arts, thank goodness. But I think as we continue down this road, we will learn new things. We will find other things that are really important. This is going to be an ever-turning wheel, and being comfortable with that and not kind of maybe doing ourselves down when we don't fix every problem is really important for us in this profession. But I think as well important to recognize that we are proceeding forward. And I do see a massive change in the way that younger performers are interpreting this or understanding it. I also see something, you haven't said anything about the notion about, I guess, performers' willingness to accept environments which aren't healthy. And that has changed enormously. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, that voice and autonomy of younger performers saying, no, I don't think I want to work with that company because they don't provide the physiotherapy and the employee assistance package and the, contract and HR support that I would expect. Wow. And I think that is really the thing that's going to move the change forward fastest.
Thanks to my guests, Claire Cordeaux and Erin Sanchez, and to you for listening. In the next episode of Performance Science, I'll be asking how we navigate financial autonomy in freelancing. Thanks to production support from Caitlin Shaughnessy, Frederick Lamb, and Michael Durrant of the Center for Performance Science, Nick Flatt at Panda, Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council for their generous support.